Hi, Misha here, and we return to 1/72 scale diecast airplane models, videos on them, with something actually new, not just a repaint or a variant. Corgi, being a mostly British-based company, has done really good in bringing us a lot of British aircraft, even some obscure ones, and of course popular ones like the Spitfire and Hurricane. We have received a few of these. This is the Bristol Blenheim. Quite an interesting aircraft, used as a light bomber and also as a night fighter early on. And from Corgi, we've received a number of these, the more famous Bristol Beaufighter. And not only does Corgi do this, but Hobbymaster does a wide range as well. But I brought out the Corgi today since it kind of fits in with our video. And the Beaufighter was designed as a heavy fighter strike aircraft. This version here is a Torpedo bomber variant, the TFX, the Mark 10. And this is, of course, quite similar in a lot of ways to the Blenheim. But there was one in between that neither Corgi nor Hobbymaster did. Bristol's Beaufort. And we finally have a Beaufort Mark 1. And this is really what came in between. The Blenheim is pre-war and early war. The Beaufort served mostly with British Coastal Command and the Australian Air Force early to mid-war, and then the Beaufighter would serve mid to late war and slightly afterwards. So not only is this an interesting and new aircraft, it really does kind of complete the lineage of the set. So let's talk about it. And for history, first up on the spinny thing, let's do the Cliff Notes version looking at the Blenheim. Remember again, blind, so doing the best I can. This started off as Bristol's Type 142, which first flew in 1935, and it was meant to be a civilian commercial transport cargo plane, 2-engine, modern. But the military was interested, and so they would make a variant known as the Type 142M. And the first of these would be delivered to the RAF in early 1937 and would be in strength by 1939. This was designed as a light bomber, reconnaissance aircraft, and later would be pressed into duty as a night fighter, having a gun pack installed. And since it was a twin-engine aircraft, it had room for the early airborne radar. Of course, later, the airborne radar could be fitted in a smaller aircraft. But in the beginning, it had to be in something as large as this. And this was reasonably successful. I don't want to overhype it. It gave Britain a relatively affordable to produce aircraft. And production would run up through about 1944, when actually would have priority, and they would build over 4,400 of these. It is about a little under 43 feet long, with a wingspan of just over 56 feet. It had a crew of 3, 2 in the front, and then we have a gunner in the dorsal position back here. Armament would change some. You've got this defensive gun here. There's also a gun kind of mounted in the wing root. And then there's a couple of forward firing guns, usually 1 or 2. And then below, there's kind of an interesting turret with a rear firing gun here. There could either be 1 or 2 firing rear in the turret. And these were all 303 machine guns fitted in different turrets. So a crew of 3, 2 up front, 1 in the back. bomb load was only about 1,200 pounds. Sounds very light by today's standards, but before World War II, it wasn't bad. And this had a max speed of about 265, maybe 270 miles per hour, tops, but a cruise speed of just under 200 miles per hour. Again, that might sound super slow, but early war, it wasn't too bad. It did, it's a mono wing and kind of a low, mid mount, and it did have retractable landing gear, something that was quite a feature for the day and time, although the tail was kind of pretty standard for what it was. And while production would be over in 44, these would serve throughout the war, although later ones would mostly be used as trainers. And the RAF was reasonably happy. It's a neat aircraft. In the past, I have done a video on this one, as well as the Night Fighter version. Probably something I should revisit. But since today's featured aircraft is directly based on this, we had to talk about it for a minute. But with no further ado, the Beaufort. And you might think this was named like, the fort for fortification, like the Flying Fortress and the B-17. But actually, no, it was the named after the Duke, I believe, might have been Earl of Beaufort near Gloucestershire. British naming. And as you can probably tell right away, if I'm actually getting this in camera, if not, again, sorry, this is very similar to the Blenheim, but bigger. And it goes back to 1935, about the same time the first Blenheim Type 142s were flying. The Air Ministry released specifications for 2 new aircraft. One was for a new Torpedo bomber to be twin-engine land-based, and another was for a general reconnaissance scout type aircraft. That was to replace the Avro Anson, and the Torpedo bomber was to replace several outdated biplanes. And Bristol got to work modifying the Blenheim so it could carry a torpedo. That was the first contract they went after. They gave it more powerful engines. They were to be Perseus engines instead of the Mercuries and the Blenheim, and elongated the fuselage a bit, made it deeper for the torpedo, and this was known as the Type 150. And the chief designer that got involved was named as Roy Fidden, for whatever that's worth. And the Air Ministry took a look, and they liked what Bristol had. Seeing the other specification and thinking they had a little time, the next year they started working on the Type 152. This was an aircraft intended to fill both the role of either torpedo bomber or reconnaissance general observation type twin-engine aircraft. So they took the Type 150, further stretched out and bulged out the hull, and made a few other little changes. It would have a crew of 3. Originally, the Type 150 was just to have a crew of 2 when it was a torpedo bomber. Fine. The crew of 3 was to give room essentially for either a turret or a radio operator or a cameraman. And the Air Ministry took a look, and they liked this, but they said, hey, why don't we do a crew of 4? That way we've got more people around for various activities, defending the aircraft or operating cameras, whatever. So Bristol took the 152 and essentially made the fuselage taller. This would give room for more people in the deck, so it kind of gives a double-decker appearance. It's a very tall fuselage. And from there, it was ordered right off the drawing board before any prototypes were even built. This was 1936, and, well, Hitler was making noise, and they knew what they needed. The main competition was from Blackburn, and it would also be adopted right off the board and ordered. That would be the, I don't know if it's the Botha or the Botha. I would tend to say Botha, but Botha, the Blackburn. And 320 of the now renamed, the Type 152 was named the Beaufort at this point. And 320 were ordered. However, since Bristol was pretty busy making Blenheims, only about 80 would be built by them. The balance would actually be built by Blackburn. Kind of interesting. But you would think, based on a regular design, it would go into production quickly, but they had problems. The first aircraft did not come out of the factory until mid-1938, and engine testing revealed a few things. First off, the Perseus engines just were not going to be powerful enough, so these had been replaced with a new engine called the Taurus. And when it was put in, it actually had not been yet approved for use by the Air Ministry. Maybe for good reason. They were having overheating troubles. They resolved some of these, and so the first plane flew October 15, 1938. But then further testing in 1939 revealed other issues. For example, when trying to fly at about 10,000 feet and do other things, it was not found to be a very good, very stable bomb platform for delivering a torpedo especially. So changes would have to be implemented. But before we get into those, let's talk about the aircraft itself. This did use some new techniques for extruding and casting of parts. It also used new alloys that the Blenheim did not. It was also designed in such a way that it could be built with modular construction, so subcontractors could build these components and then they could be easily transported by rail and then assembled and tested at a factory. This would actually play a major role in why Australia adopted it, and would become maybe the most famous user even. So the technology here was advanced, but despite their notions to save weight, this was about 25% heavier overall than the Blenheim. And like I said, they did put more powerful engines in, but they would have troubles pretty much throughout, especially early on. Then they did a few things to try to improve aerodynamics. For example, the nacelles the engines are in were streamlined. And so it did have a higher top speed. Now, it was able to carry more of a payload. We'll get into that in just a minute, though, because there's actually a lot of options. It does have a crew of 4, as their ministry wanted. The top speed early on was just over 270 miles per hour. However, it had a cruise quite a bit better than the Blenheim of between 225 and 250 miles per hour. So quite a bit significant higher cruise. Later versions would bump up to 280 as a top speed, and even some unarmed transports could get to 300 mph. Its maximum altitude was actually less than the Blenheim, but keep in mind the Blenheim was designed as a light bomber. This was designed as a torpedo aircraft and general reconnaissance, so altitude wasn't important. What was more important was range, and this actually had quite good range. 16 to 1700 miles on early versions. Some later versions with the Wasp engines, the twin Wasp, that would go down to about 1500. But they could always put in additional fuel tanks if they needed to. And originally, defensive armament was a single 303 Vickers in this rear kind of slightly recessed turret. But during 1938-1939 testing, even before serial production, this was turned into a double 303 machine gun turret. It would retain, at least on some versions, the machine gun in the port wing, like the Blenheim. Other versions would do away with it. Some versions would get beam-mounted Vickers 303s. And some versions, like this one here, have kind of that rear-firing gun. It's not exactly a turret. It's more of a blister. This is actually the entry door for the aircraft, and it's near that, firing rearward. Bleh. And sometimes they even put 2 down there. So anyway, my point is, machine guns were anywhere from 3 to 7. I think some might have even had 8. And they were 303s in British service, although the Aussies would fit them with 50 cows, at least some of the time. As far as the offense, this is where the aircraft really does shine over the Blenheim. It could carry quite the range of ordnance. Primarily, it could carry a torpedo, and it carried it in an interesting manner. It does have a bomb bay, but to fit the torpedo and to make it part of the reconnaissance role, they kind of compromised and went to a semi-recessed torpedo system. It would be the Mark 12 torpedo, 18 inches, and about 1,600 pounds. It could also carry a 2,000-pound bomb, again semi-recessed in the bomb bay, or it could carry about 1,500 pounds with 1,000 pounds in the bay fully closed and another 500 pounds hanging off the wings. So maximum load about 2,000 pounds or 1,500 pounds in smaller bombs. So much higher capacity and flexibility than the Blenheim. It could even carry and drop magnetic mines for mining operations, or gardening as the RAF called it. And serial production would begin in November of 1939, and service would pick up at the beginning of 1940, because by this point, of course, we're in war. Oh, by the way, even though the Beaufort was quite a bit heavier than the Blenheim, it wasn't much larger. The wingspan was only about 18 inches more, so around 58 feet, and the fuselage overall length was only about 44 feet. So, yeah, mostly it was just more vertical. Once in production, these were quickly started training up in January of 1940, and in the UK they would be used by RAF Coastal Command. That was the main focus. The Navy Fleet A Arm would have a few as well for reconnaissance and training. The first missions were in April. It was also the time the 2nd Squadron started training up with these. They were actually those gardening missions. They were laying mines in the ocean and channels. And this was because they were having trouble with torpedoes, and they were having trouble training crews who were used to biplanes on how to use these as torpedo bombers. So it took a little while for torpedoes to come into play. So they would either drop mines or they would use just conventional bombs. And they would go after German shipping in 1940 in the summer. And in September, there would be the first torpedo mission. Actually, the first British torpedo mission of the war, in which a 6-ton merchant ship would be sunk. However, there was another bump along the road. These were actually grounded for a time, about May through July, maybe August of 1940. And a commission found that it was problems with the Taurus engines. They just were unreliable. Aircraft weren't coming back. They didn't know what happened. Of course, they were ditching over the ocean, so kind of tragic. And took a little time. They never really did get the Taurus lined out. They considered doing some with the Twin Wasp, and that actually would end up being the Beaufort Mark II in the UK. But they had supply issues getting enough Twin Wasp, either from the USA or domestically produced. So for the most part, the majority of these were built with the Taurus engines. And they did improve things a bit, and they would add more machine guns. They would start really going after German warships, quite famously the Scharnhorst they would go after. The Gneisenau, the battleship Gneisenau, one would actually hit with a torpedo. In fact, that's what this model is from here. It is from a run in April. The plan was to send aircraft in with conventional bombs to break up the anti-torpedoes protecting the battleship, and then use torpedoes. But unfortunately, the bomb-carrying airplanes weren't able to take off due to poor weather that morning, couldn't get off the runway. So only the torpedo-armed ones flew, and they got lost, and only this one made it. Even though it was shot down by AA fire, it did deliver a torpedo, and it did hit the battleship. And it did actually damage it enough that it was in port for about half a year getting repairs done. So it took it out of action for the majority of 1941. It should be said that to the crew of this that lost their lives, it was very hard to line up for a torpedo. This was a pretty fast-moving aircraft, pretty heavy too. They had to get below 100 feet altitude, usually 60 to 70, and they needed to start off at about 600, 700, 800 yards away from the target, no more than 1,000, and really no less than 400 or 500. And they had to fly quite level and straight, which meant they were a big target for AA fire. So it was a harrowing mission, and that's why the crew of this, or at least the pilot, was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously, and why they did this model. So with that, let's take a look at this model and the details from Corgi. Looking at the model itself, as I said at the beginning, 1/72 scale diecast. Gear up or down, here they are. These are metal with rubber wheels. Got the doors, of course they're plastic. And it does come with a Mark 12 torpedo. And here's all the doors if you want to display it in the partially enclosed bay. Now, looking at the Beaufighter for a minute, this came with a torpedo too, but because of how the stand mounts, you can't have the torpedo on with it on the stand. And I was happy to see they fixed it with this one. You might have wondered why it has such a tall stem and why it's mounted pretty far rear. Well, that's because you can display it with the torpedo in. Sorry, this is a metal piece, the bomb bay area. It all comes out as one single piece. You just pull it out from the sides, and you can put your torpedo in the hole that's left and put your doors in. It even comes with kind of internal sections for the front and rear. And with all that on, it will still mount on the stand thanks to this stem and the relative rear placement. So good on Corgi. Very much a metal plane. The wings are metal. I think most of the tail is. That's plastic. So the vertical fin is metal. The horizontals are plastic. The wings are metal. The fuselage is, of course, metal. So aside from the antenna and the guns, and of course the glass, even, like I said, the plate for the bomb bay is metal. And I'm happy that this is one that actually has the metal stem for the stand as well. Not only does it seem a little stronger, it actually gives weight to the stand, so it doesn't want to topple over as well. So good job, Corgi. I like Corgis. There are ways that Hobby Masters are better, but Corgis are a little more durable. They don't have as many options maybe, but I don't know. And they do a lot of the British aircraft that I really enjoy. Neat torpedo too, including its fins. And this is plastic, by the way. It would have been kind of neat if the torpedo was metal, but it might have been hard to keep it stuck in if it had some weight pulling it down. But again, at least your wheels are metal. With that, let's get back to the history. Oh, by the way, the rear turret does have some traverse to it. It's just very stiff on mine. Back to the history. Back to service. Throughout 1941, these would be used to lay mines, drop conventional bombs, drop torpedoes, and early on they had some success with torpedoes, but this would become diminishing returns as time would go on. And by 1942, when these were deployed to try to take advantage of what's known as the Channel Dash, or Operation Cerberus, that's when Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prince Eugen tried to get out. They were pretty ineffective, but they did harass the German ships, and Losses weren't that terrible for the British on these, less than you'd think. That said, only 6 British squadrons in the home islands flew these, and of those, only 4 in combat missions. In fact, it's quite famously known that more of these were lost in accidents than to enemy action. And the Beaufort flew more hours in training than it actually did in combat. And in England, they only built just over 1,100 of these, with the majority being the Mark I and its variants, and a few being the Mark II, which had the twin Wasp engines and its variants. And there was also the T Mark II, which was a trainer, didn't have the armament, including the dorsal turret. And those would fly for a great deal of time. So after the failed Channel Dash, that was kind of the end of operations out of the UK in 1942, and the end of combat for the Beaufort there. However, its story is very much far from over. 3 different British squads flew the Beaufort in the Mediterranean and Middle East areas. The first began re-equipping from older aircraft in August of 1941. They were flying out of Egypt. And then beginning in January and running through the spring, there was actually a transfer of British units to Malta. And these would essentially strike the Italians. Now, up north, these were called rover flights, where they just kind of go out and seek and destroy. When they would do something somewhat similar in the Mediterranean area, just harassing first Italian, then later Italian and German convoys. And they would even have some success against Italian cruisers, Italian warships, but mostly merchantmen. And just being a nuisance. This is where their long-range, good endurance, and by this time, 1942, at least the engine troubles had been worked out about as well as they could. And so we'd see pretty continuous operations throughout 1942 and helping with the Operation Torch and all that good stuff. And the final missions in this arena were around May and June of 1943. And the Beaufort's time as a bomber was coming to an end because back in March of 1942, the first of these was tested. A variant of the Beaufighter able to deliver a torpedo. So with that coming out in 1943, squadrons started converting over to the torpedo version, replacing the Beaufort. So these would go back home and be used for training and some reconnaissance duties near the home shores. And of course, by this point too, the war starting to turn in favor more and more of the British, certainly after D-Day. They would continue to roll out of the factories up until about 1944. And in 1945, with the end of the war, they were declared obsolete, and they worked on retiring them. And the last Beaufort was out of British service by 1946. But let's briefly talk about Australian service. Australia was looking for a new general reconnaissance aircraft, bomber aircraft, patrol aircraft, maritime, that it could build. And in July of 1939, after looking at what Britain had, they sent over a delegation. They selected the new Beaufort. The modular construction really did help, and they drew upon that. They actually used railway factories making different automotive and locomotive parts to make sub-assemblies, and then they would be assembled and tested at DAP, the Department of Air Production. They had a factory in Melbourne, and they would actually set up a second factory in New South Wales to build these. And the whole process began in May of 1940, and the first Australian assembled using British parts aircraft flew in May of 1941, and then the first true Australian version came out in August of that year. And originally, the idea was 180 would be produced for Far East Command, the Commonwealth Far East Command, for use in places like Singapore. But after their own experiences, plus Japan joining the war, these were diverted to the Australian Air Force, and about 20 had been delivered in December of 1941, and the first squadrons in Australian service started training up in February of 42, and they learned from the British, and they took more time in training, not having their first combat mission until that summer. And they would use these to harass Japanese shipping, and they would hit several Japanese merchantmen, even warships, with torpedoes, bombs. They would be used in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in 1943, and while they would not directly sink any transport, they sowed confusion and got the Japanese to do some things that did lead to several transports being lost or, ill-used. And it was very important. According to William Green, a historian, it was probably the single most important aircraft of its type in the Southwest Pacific during the war, because Australia was able to build a lot of these thanks to its design and construction. They were building up to one a day at one point for a total of 700, so nearly as many in Australia as Britain, and it actually really pushed their aircraft industry forward into the post-war era. And they would continue to fly these. Much like in the UK, it would be replaced by the Beaufighter beginning in 1944. Australian production would actually end slightly before UK. The last UK Beaufort would be in November. The last Australian would be in August of 1944. And again, they would both pretty much be retired at the end of the war. I'm not going to go too much into it here because hopefully Corgi will do an Aussie version and we can talk about that later on. But I had to give credit to the DAP and their production of the Beaufort since it was such a crucial part of their war effort. And the same goes for talking variants. Hopefully Corgi will do more. Like I said, the British Mark I had the Taurus engines. The Mark II would have twin Wasp, and it did have a higher top speed but slightly less range. It was more reliable, but they built only about 160 of them because they just couldn't get enough. So the over 1,000 built in the UK were the Taurus. They would also, like I said, have the trainer version. About 250 of those were built. I think most were just conversions of older aircraft. They just pull off the armament. And they would add more machine guns and a few other things, and the antenna for the aerials, all that would change a bit. But Australia really did more with it. They started off with the Mark V. They would only build a handful of these, with imported from the USA Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines. And then with the Mark V-A, they would introduce a larger tail that worked better with the different engines. The Mark VI and Mark VII were very similar, also built in very small numbers, and they had different propellers, different props, just different manufacturers. These all had twin Wasps, and I believe most were still imported. It was the Mark VIII that over 500 were built in Australia, and this was the version. It had Australian-built, under license twin Wasp engines. It had a greater fuel capacity. And they would even improve the armament halfway through production, going to Browning 50 caliber machine guns, at least in some of the locations. And they would make a few other improvements as well as introducing new and better radar and sensors and that kind of thing. And the final version in Australia would be the Mark IX, which was so-called the Beaufreighter. This was an unarmed passenger freight version that could carry about 4,600 pounds of either people or goods. And that's the one that had the best top speed of about 300 mph. And combined with the range, it was quite useful. But by 1944, the Beaufighter was definitely replacing the Beaufort in most duties, aside from being a freighter. The Beaufighter, the Beau. Not to go too deep into this, really work began really right around the time the Beaufort was starting, development and production and all that, 1938. And it was designed at first as a heavy fighter, and was named the Type 156 by the factory. And by 1939, these were ordered, and really they were starting to be received by 1940. It went into production so quickly because they used a lot of components from the Beaufort, sub-assemblies and what have you. It started off as a heavy fighter. Because of its size and everything, it quickly became the best night fighter they had. And then, as I said earlier, the torpedo version, the TFX, the Mark 10 here, was first tested in March of 1942 and was put into production in the middle of 1943, so began to replace the Beaufort in that role. And in almost every way, it was a superior aircraft. It used new Hercules engines. They did also have some versions with Merlins. Much more reliable, especially after they worked out the initial bugs. And it's a little shorter, about 41 feet. About the same wingspan, maybe a couple inches shorter, about 57.5, 58 feet. Lighter aircraft. Didn't have an internal bomb bay, although it could carry either one torpedo or a couple of 500-pound bombs underneath the wings. It had a lot of guns in the front. The turret often had no gun at all. This version it does. This was often just the place for the radar operator or the spotter. It only had a crew of 2. Yeah, just a smaller thing. In a lot of ways, it was faster. The fighter version is about 320 miles per hour, and the torpedo version was still over 300 miles per hour. So significant increase over the Beaufort and a better torpedo delivery system. They could use the Mark 12 or Mark 13 torpedoes. And actually the Mark 10 was the most produced version. They built over 2,200, and these were licensed, produced in Australia as well. So both areas. And in total they built just under 6,000. Production would end in around September 1945 in the UK and would last until early 1946 in Australia, although service would continue in some areas up to 1960. Very successful plane, and really was built on the lessons from the Beaufort. And if you want, I can definitely do an updated Beaufighter video. I think this is my only Corgi model, but I do have a couple of the Hobby Masters besides. There's a lot of versions and variants. They're pretty cool. But that's really why I wanted the Beaufort so much, is it's that gap in between the Blenheim and the Beaufighter, although these were all designed for different roles. Again, the Blenheim was originally a light bomber, and this was originally a heavy fighter, and the Beaufort was originally a torpedo and reconnaissance aircraft, but they kind of all merged. So that's why I brought them all out today. Well, let's wrap things up. And there we have it, folks. I know I haven't done many airplane videos lately. There just hasn't been a lot new. Plus, if I'm being honest, a lot of the new models, especially if I'm like Hobby Master, are just getting very expensive. And there's not a lot of new stuff. But when they announced the Beaufort last year, I immediately put a pre-order in for one, and I'm not disappointed. I didn't think I would be. I really like I've got 2 of these Blenheims. I have the Night Fighter version, but I figured since we're talking more bombers, this would be appropriate. I really like this little plane. And yeah, the Beaufighter, I think I've got 3 of these in total. And it's such a iconic part of British World War II and Australian, whereas the Blenheim and the Beaufort are a little forgotten today. So I'm happy that Corgi gave them some love and even a few versions of the Blenheim, and that's why I'm hoping they'll do versions of the Beaufort, as long as the price doesn't go crazy. I think this one was $65? I don't know. No, I think it was low. I think it was 90. I think I'm thinking of another Corgi's on the order. But, yeah, oh well. It is what it is. But I really like it, and it kind of completes my set. Nice Corgi quality. You know what you're going to get, for better or worse. Good, stable, and they use a lot of metal in their planes. So if I'm buying diecast, I do want there to be metal. And as I mentioned at the middle of the video, I like that you can display it with the torpedo. in the belly and still on the stand. I wish they had done that with the Beaufighter, but oh well, it's all good. If you want me to revisit these other two planes or some other British planes, let me know and I'll try to get it in there. But for today, here's something new, and probably the next aircraft video we'll do something. Well, this is something new that's old. Now, next time we'll do something old that's new. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.